Salam, peace to you all. I'm Adnan Hussein, director of the School of Religion and a professor in the Department of History. I also direct the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project here at Queen's University. For those of you unfamiliar with MSGP, it is a project dedicated to sponsorship of academic research and public educational events on the Middle East, Islamic world, and Muslim diasporic minorities globally. You can find out more and learn about our upcoming events later this month and beyond by visiting our website, our Facebook page, following us on Twitter, and signing up on our email list. You can see the contact information, I don't know if it's to my right or to my left in your view, but on this page. We hope to connect with you and can always use your support. I also want to notify you of an upcoming podcast that we're starting. You can find the very first episode at https://anchor.fm/MSGP-Queens. I'm delighted to welcome you to our inaugural event of the academic year and the first Queens event marking Islamic History Month this October. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of History, the School of Religion, the Office of Faith and Spiritual Life at Queen's University, and also our partners in the community, the Islamic Society of Kingston and its Islamic History Month Committee, which held yesterday a wonderful panel discussion entitled From Resistance to Revolution: The Impacts of Black Muslims in North America, which was on this year's theme, honoring the resilience and achievements of Black Muslims. As you may know, we had planned this as an in-person public lecture for last March, but delayed it to the fall in the hopes that we could be all together in a room and have some refreshments of mind and of body. But we have adapted to an online format. So I have to thank Gabriela Castillo and Amal Ben Salem for their work in organizing this event. The good news is that we're able to welcome many more of you, perhaps from all over the world, well beyond Kingston, to the event. We're honored today to have Dr. Juan Cole, Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan, with us. He is a distinguished scholar who has lived, taught, researched, and published widely across the Islamic world, from the Arab Middle East to South Asia. And rather uniquely, he's studied a wide range of periods, including the late antique Near East and Arabian Peninsula on the origins of Islam, to its diverse contemporary expressions all across the Middle East and Islamic world. He's also studied a variety of, done scholarly study in a variety of disciplines. His main area of expertise is history, but he also has published on literature of the Middle East. A full account of his writings, numbering 19 works and over 100 articles, would take the remainder of this session. So I'll just note that his most recent work is a new translation and study of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the Persian poet. And in the History Seminar series, just a couple of weeks ago, we were privileged to engage in a fascinating discussion with Dr. Cole on his new forthcoming study of the reception of the Rubaiyat in 19th and 20th century culture. He's of course well known to you as a frequent expert commentator on news programs and other media, as a major public intellectual whose op-eds and blog, The Indispensable Informed Comment, have informed so many of us about crucial topics and provided an invaluable understanding of our world. Tonight, he'll be talking about a recent book of his, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. I'll note that this is available at the Novel Idea bookstore in downtown Kingston, but I encourage you, even if you're not in Kingston, to support and patronize your independent local booksellers wherever you are. Please send your questions for the discussion period at the end of the lecture in the Facebook chat. I'll gather them together and pose them to Dr. Cole at the end of his presentation. But for now, let's welcome Dr. Juan Cole and thank him for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Adnan, for that warm and generous welcome to the program. I want to talk today about some of my findings with regard um, to peace as a theme in the Quran and very early Islam. And I should begin by saying that the religion of Islam began roughly 6 centuries after Christ, at a time when the Roman Empire had become Christian. Christianity was its state religion. And there were still, I think there's good evidence, pagan populations in the Christian Roman Empire. But they were, by that time, in the early 600s of the Common Era, minorities. On the other hand, on the frontiers of the empire, I think we can imagine that paganism survived better because it was beyond the grasp of the more fanatical Christian Roman emperors, some of whom persecuted pagans. And they're in places like Alexandria and Damascus, their temples were defunded. Some were just defaced, but Islam grew up on this frontier, what is today Jordan, and near it, Israel and Palestine, Syria. This area was Roman and Christian, but as you went south into the Arabian Peninsula, you get Medina and Mecca, and that's where Islam grows up. So according to the Quran, this is still a heavily pagan area. Now, the other important background here is that at the time that Islam grew up, there was a huge, what I call world war going on between the Christian Roman Empire and the Iranian Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians had Yemen to the south of Mecca and Medina. They had what is now Iraq, Mesopotamia. They had the Iranian plateau. They had some of the Caucasus. They had some of Central Asia and what is now Pakistan, or some of what is now Pakistan. So they were the Eastern Empire. The Romans had the Near East. They had Syria, what is now Turkey, and as I said, what is now Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Tunisia, and so forth. So the two empires were fighting with one another. And the significant thing that happened, because the fighting was nothing new, they would raid each other and there were wars from time to time. But the significant thing that happened was that in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, in the 610s, after he had started preaching, we think, the Iranians came in force and took away the Near East from the Christian Roman Empire. So the Iranian Zoroastrians, because they followed the Zoroastrian religion, were suddenly ruling much of Anatolia, much of what is today Turkey, and they ruled Syria, Transjordan, what is today Israel and Palestine. They took Egypt, so this was a remarkable turn of events, which provoked a great deal of millenarian anxiety. People thought this is the end of the world, and in 614, in particular, the Iranians took Jerusalem, and there's a lot of new work on this world war between the Iranians and the Eastern Rome, and as a context for the rise of Islam. And one of the most important thinkers in this regard has been Glenn Bowersock, a distinguished classicist who had a long and enviable career writing about the Roman Empire, and who turned late in life to this issue of the Near East and Islam. And in his books, he sees this Roman-Iranian war as crucial to the rise of Islam as a context for it. And very importantly, he had a key insight which overturns a great deal of writing about all this, both among Muslims and among Western historians. He sees evidence in the Quran and in the later commentary literature that at least at some points, the Prophet Muhammad and his followers in Western Arabia tilted towards the Christian Roman Empire, whereas typically, as far as we can tell, Jews and Zoroastrians and Miaphysite Christians tilted often towards the Sasanians. I should back up and say that anything one says about this period involves a certain amount of conjecture. Bowersock has earned his conjectures by tremendous lifetime scholarship, and I think he's onto something. But we also do have to that the literature is very thin. When I started writing about this, I decided that I would try to read all the books that were contemporary with the Quran and were produced anywhere within a couple thousand miles of it. And that might sound like a tall order, but as I looked into it, I discovered that there were maybe 25 at most, and some of them are not so much books as thin pamphlets. There just isn't very much information about this period. And on the Roman side, there are very few primary sources. What few primary sources we do have produced in that era, however, do provide some evidence for the Bowersock thesis, and it's one that I have taken up. Now, let me back up and say that although the primary sources are thin on the ground, there are new primary sources that are coming to the fore now that weren't available or hadn't been incorporated by previous historians. One of these are the Safavidic inscriptions, which span kind of the time of Christ till about 400 of the Common Era, after which they peter out. Although there are newly found inscriptions even beyond 400, but the ones up until 400 show the Arabic-speaking peoples of Eastern Syria and Transjordan and the Hejaz, Western Arabia, as largely pagan. And so I'm showing you one of these inscriptions, and it says it's by a man named Zan, and he's from the Daif tribe. And he was a commander, it says, in the year that Caesar ejected the Persians. And then it says, and so Allah, may he enjoy peace and security. And the he here is Zan. So this is probably a reference to one of those earlier Persian Arab wars, Persian Roman wars, maybe in the 200s. But here it shows the interest of the Arabic speakers in the reign of Caesar as a way of dating. And then there's this other inscription that I'll draw your attention to, which the great archaeologist and linguist Ahmed El-Jalad has interpreted. And it says that the inscription was written in the year that word was sent to Caesar that the people of the Roman Empire died and Damascus burned. And I have transliterated the old Arabic here. Those who know Arabic can probably make it out. So The point here is that this was clearly written by an Arabic-speaking person who was loyal to the Roman Empire, and was upset that the Iranians or their proxies had come in and set fires in Damascus. Again, we don't have an exact date on this, but could be in the 200s. So the Arabophone tribes, the Arabic-speaking tribes of this region, were increasingly integrated into the empire, and I would argue they became more integrated as time went on, so that after Constantine started backing Christianity in the 300s, gradually the population of the empire started following that religion, and within 150 years, it seems to have become the vast majority. And the Arabic-speaking people were no exception. They largely converted to Christianity, and they served the Christian Roman Empire as border guards or limitani, or as tribal cavalry adjuncts to the Roman army, the federati. And there was a line that they helped to guard called the Arabian line, from which tribes allied with Iran or independent actors would make raids and seek booty and loot in the empire. And so there were loyal Arab tribes that helped the Roman army to patrol that and garrison that Arabian line. Now, the historian of the 6th century, Procopius, a great chronicler of the wars of Justinian, alleges at one point that one of these Arabic-speaking chieftains called a phylarch in the Roman Empire, who had an official position as a kind of provincial governor, actually had so much claim on the Hejaz that he gifted it to the emperor, to Justinian. So the Western Arabia, which is depicted in the later Muslim sources as kind of isolated and connected to Inner Arabia, if we read the late antique sources, seems actually to have a lot to do with the Roman Empire, and indeed with the Persian Empire as well. It doesn't seem to be isolated, and people are claiming actually to have political influence there from the empires. So I mentioned that in 613, Damascus fell. And there's a controversial verse in the Quran, which I believe refers to this event. And I translate it: Rome lies vanquished in the nearest province, but in the wake of their defeat, they will triumph after a few years. Before and after, it is God who is in command. On that day, the believers will rejoice in the victory of God. He causes to triumph whomever he will, and he is the mighty, the merciful. It is the promise of God. God does not break his promises, but most people do not know it. This seems to me clearly a sign of that phenomenon that Bowersock saw of Rome, of the early Muslims tilting towards Rome. And the defeat of Rome is regretted up at probably Damascus, but it is predicted that they'll come back and will prevail. What hasn't been really focused on in Muslim exegesis of this verse is that this ultimate victory of the Christian Roman Empire is referred to in the Quran as the victory of God. And moreover, it is said that the believers, which is to say the followers of Muhammad, will rejoice in the victory of God when the Romans vanquished the Iranians. And the verse can be read in other ways. The grammar of classical Arabic, of Quranic Arabic, is such that you could actually read it the opposite way around. That Rome has become victorious in the nearest province. But in my view, that doesn't make any sense, and I prefer this reading of it, which is the majority reading through history. Now, some might object that it has a prophecy in it, which happens to have come true, and maybe it's ex post facto, but actually this sentiment that's in the Quran occurs in contemporary texts, and so there is a chronicle of Theophylactos Simokatis, which predicts that there will be 21 years of Sasanian rule and then 7 years of Roman restoration, at which the end of the world will come. And this text actually sounds a lot like the Quran. There's another text by a Christian who was trying to convert Jews, and it also talks about how, well, the Roman Empire has shrunk a bit, but it'll come back. So this attitude in the Quran, if we look at other late antique sources contemporary with it, is not out of line. There's nothing unusual about this sentiment. And then the first extended commentary on the Quran, which was written admittedly much, much later, 150 years later, by Muqatil bin Sulaiman al-Balkhi, says, in explaining this verse, says, Rome and the Iranians fought, and Rome was vanquished, and this news reached the Prophet and his companions in Mecca and was grievous for them. The pagans rejoiced and gloated and confronted the companions of the Prophet, saying, you are people of the book, and the Romans are people of the book, that is to say, the Bible. But our brethren, the people of Iran, have triumphed over your siblings from the Roman Empire. So the pagans are depicted as pro-Iranian, pro-Sasanian, whereas the believers around Muhammad and then the Christians were pro-Roman. Now, coming to this issue of peace, there's a whole set of verses in the Quran having to do with peace, which in part, it seems to me, surely are reacting against this massive war that's going on all around them. We know from Greek sources that the Arabic-speaking people had customs and practices around peace. They had a sacred meeting place, he says, consecrated to one of the gods, where they assembled. During these meetings, he says, complete peace prevails, not only among themselves, but with the people in the region. Even the animals are at peace, both with themselves and with human beings. So these we know from Arabic sources. He's talking about haram, which is a sanctuary dedicated to a deity in the vicinity of which no feuding or fighting is allowed, and hema, which is a sanctuary where no hunting or cutting down of trees is allowed. So this is a text allegedly going back to the 6th century from a non-Arab source, and it is in accordance with what we know from the Arabic sources. And so Mecca, where the Prophet was born and began preaching, was surely a sanctuary. It had a shrine to Allah, to the God, and in Christian Arabic, Al-Ilah, the God, was used instead of theos, instead of the Greek word for God. And we have inscriptions demonstrating that this is true. And so the word just seems to mean God when a monotheist uses it. But of course, for the pagans, Allah was one of the gods, maybe the chief god. They seem to have thought he was the creator God. But that had Mecca had a sanctuary, which the Quran indicates was dedicated to God, although the Quran complains that the pagans didn't only dedicate it to God. The Quran speaks of how the Prophet Muhammad began preaching to these pagans and received a negative reaction from some of them. Some of them taunted him and his followers, harassed them. There's no mention in the early chapters of the Quran of any violence directed towards them, but certainly assaults on their status and character were made. And the question then becomes, well, how does one respond to those attacks? And the Quran says, be patient with what they say and take your leave of them graciously. Leave the affluent who impugn you to me, giving them a respite. So we see this in the New Testament as well. And authors who have written about the New Testament verses on nonviolence have talked about, there's a passage from Paul which says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, that one of the reasons that one doesn't respond in kind to attacks is because that would be impudent. It would be beyond one's station that this is something that you should leave to God. The word here, for being patient, be patient with them. Also, in late antiquity was a very important concept of patience as forbearance and tolerance, and it shows up in late antique authors as well. But beyond withdrawing graciously, literally, beautifully from company when one is attacked, what does the Quran say beyond that? And in the sort of middle Mecca chapters, sort of in the, say, 616, 617 perhaps, as far as we can tell, the Quran starts going beyond that and advising not even just turning the other cheek, but actually doing good to those who do evil to you. So it says, whose discourse is more beautiful than the one who summons others to God and performs good deeds and proclaims, I am a monotheist. Good and evil are not equal. Repel the latter with the greater good, and behold, your enemy will become a devoted patron. So the Quran is advising that one love one's enemies. And there's a verse in which Muhammad is given voice in the Quran where he says that I would, if it had been my own choice, I would have arranged for all of my pagan enemies to have beautiful houses and gold and good things, but I'm not allowed to do that because it would give them the impression that it's all right to be pagan. But if it were up to him, he would like to bestow good things on his enemies. And so in this verse, the early community of Muhammad is commanded to do good to one's enemy. And this is quite a remarkable passage. It's a kind of, there's a set of such verses which are a kind of scattered equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount, which, however, have not been problematized as a group in the same way that sermon has been in scholarship. Not only is the sentiment in that verse of the Quran perhaps a little similar to, say, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew or Luke, but in another chapter, Qisas, or the stories, the Quran gives some indication of a Christian context for some of these sentiments, and it says, these shall be given their wage twice over because they patiently endured and avert evil with good and expend of what we have provided them, and if they hear abusive speech, they turn away from it and say to us our deeds, and to you your deeds, peace be upon you, we do not want the rowdy. And this is another such gospel-like image of wishing peace on one's enemy and then being rewarded. And at one point, this kind of sentiment is also attributed by the Quran to those who have received the previous scripture. So I think the Quran sometimes sets up Christians as models for how to deal with this kind of social persecution of being taunted and harassed and so forth. And we know there were monks like Maximus, who was a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. He has a commentary on 400 aphorisms, or he has 400 aphorisms about love. And these kinds of sentiments are there in this book that's contemporaneous with the Quran. And so the Christian monks did advocate this sort of thing. Now, when the early community around Muhammad was expelled from Mecca in 622 and took refuge in the nearby city of Medina or Yathrib, and then militant pagans came after them and began attacking them, the Quran starts allowing what I see as defensive war. And again, this is not unusual in late antique thought. You take someone like St. Augustine or St. Ambrose, church fathers who lived in the centuries just before Muhammad. On the one hand, they upheld the principle of turning the other cheek as a personal ethical matter. But then they also were very enthusiastic to support the wars of the Christian Roman Empire. And Augustine very much approved of those wars and defended them and developed a kind of doctrine of just war. And Ambrose said that if you let, others come and attack and injure innocent people in front of your eyes and you don't lift a hand to stop it, then you're as bad as the attackers. Now, this is a church father. This is somebody who's standing for the Sermon on the Mount in other circumstances. So I don't see that the Quran is taking a stance here of allowing self-defense or warfare in self-defense as unusual. And I think the Meccan verses just have a different context. There it's talking about being harassed and taunted and insulted, and that individuals should then respond by loving their enemies, giving them good in return for evil. But if somebody's got a sword in his hand and is coming to kill your wife or children, then the Quran feels like you have to make a stand. What's remarkable is that there's a verse later in the Quran during this great war between the Romans and the Iranians, where it says that, I translated that God endorsed those who fought because they had been wronged, and in truth, God is able to aid them, those who were expelled from their homes unjustly, solely for saying our Lord is God. That is to say, the followers of Muhammad who had been forced out of Mecca to Medina. Had God not checked one people with another, then monasteries, churches, oratories, and places of worship wherein God is much mentioned would have been razed to the ground. God aids those who aid him. God is powerful and mighty. Well, what does that mean? Now, mind you, that word biya in Arabic is a loan from Aramaic, and most of the people in the Near East were Aramaic speakers, for church. There isn't any doubt what it means. And it seems to me that this verse is saying, if we look at it in the context, that those battles that the followers of Muhammad fought against the pagans in Mecca in the 620s had as one of their side effects that the churches and monasteries of the northern Hijaz and into Transjordan and Syria were protected then from the pagan onslaught. And moreover, if we think that the pagans, as Bowersock argued, were allied with the Sasanian, Iranian, Zoroastrians, then it's also implying that those institutions in Western Arabia, which weren't already in Persian hands, because of course they had Syria, would be protected by the followers of Muhammad. So these wars that were fought, the Battle of Badr and so forth, and Uhud, by the early followers of Muhammad in the Hijaz are being depicted in this verse as having implications for the safety of the Christians. And indeed, throughout the Quran, there is a fairly consistent pro-Christian attitude. Christianity is sometimes critiqued theologically, but not socially. Monks are praised and seen as pious. And then there's a verse very late in the Quran, we think, where it says, you will find that those most intensely hostile to the believers are Jews and pagans. And you will find that the nearest to them in love are those who say we are Christians. That is because they have among them priests and monks, and they are not haughty. And when they hear what has been revealed to the messenger, you see their eyes overflowing with tears, inasmuch as they recognize the truth and say, our Lord, we have believed, so inscribe us among those who bear witness. This verse seems to suggest that some Christians in Western Arabia converted, but I don't think it can be read to say that. It's saying that the early community of Muhammad found safe haven. They found relationships of love and warmth with Christians in a way that they didn't with Jews and pagans. And if we understand that the Jews and the pagans are allied with the Iranians, and the early believers in Muhammad are allied with the Roman Christians, then this becomes a political statement. And mind you, as soon as that war was over with Iran, because the Romans won beginning in big time in 628 when they invested the capital of the Sasanian Empire. But then the Iranians gradually withdrew from the Near East. Heraclius, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, was angry at the Jewish community, which was quite large in Galilee and Tiberias and so forth, for having, he alleged, sided with the Iranians while they were in occupation of those regions. And when he reconquered them, he was going to outlaw Judaism and just force all the Jews to convert. And that might have happened if he had kept those regions. He didn't, because ironically enough, ultimately, the Muslims took them. But in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, that kind of verse is compatible with what we know about the politics of the time. Now, just to wrap up, because I know it's hard to listen to a long talk on Zoom, but there are a couple other pieces of evidence for my argument that I want to enter here. One is that there are elements of Christian Roman law which seem awfully similar to Quranic law. So there's a passage in the Code of Justinian, or the novels of Justinian. He issued laws. There's a passage in 134 where he condemns banditry, basically, brigandage, robbery, theft, violent theft. And he said that there are several appropriate punishments, and he was directing this at his magistrates of the empire. One was amputation of a hand. one was exile, one was execution, or a fourth was vague, it was chastisement. So Al-Ma'idah 533 in the Quran, the table, virtually paraphrases this passage from Justinian's novel. It says, those who wreak corruption in the earth, which probably means looting and plundering, should be dealt with by amputation, exile, execution, or crucifixion. So the three of the exact punishments mentioned by Justinian are there in this verse. And then the fourth, which takes the place of chastisement, is crucifixion, which is a Roman imperial punishment visited typically on political rebels, people guilty of what was called listia in Greek, or it can be banditry or it can be political rebellion. And of course, that's why Jesus was crucified by the Romans, because they viewed him as a political rebel potentially. Well, that's awfully odd. If I'm right about this, and I think I am, then the Quran is endorsing aspects of Christian Roman law, which would make sense if, as we have argued, the early community was allied with Christian Rome. And then a final piece of evidence is that the Quran contains an epitome, a short recapitulation of the Alexander legend in the chapter of the cave, or Surah Al-Kahf, and in which Alexander is praised for putting up a barrier to the barbarians of the East. Well, this is Christian Roman propaganda during the war with the Sasanians. Heraclius was cast as a second Alexander. And I think the Quran is here again praising the Christian Roman emperor by telling this story about Alexander, which is an allegory for the defense of the empire from the hordes of the East, in this case, the Iranians. The fact is that on the whole and by and large, there are some exceptions. The Iranians hated Alexander because he overthrew the Achaemenid Empire and destroyed Persepolis. And the Zoroastrian mobeds, or priests, curse him no end of times. So that the Quran has this story about Alexander, who's called the two-horned one, as a positive figure and as someone defending civilization from invading Eastern hordes. This is all another indication that the Quran is kind of on the same page with the empire. And so I just see these signs of the Quran's partisanship for the Roman Empire during the war with Khosrow II, and they're present throughout the text. The kind words towards Christians, the praise for Christian personal ethics, and the very Sermon on the Mount-like passages of the Mecca period. All of these come together to suggest an intersection between the rise of Islam and these wars of the 7th century and Christian culture as it then existed. So I'll stop there and we can open.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Cole, for this very interesting perspective on the Quran's pro-Roman, pro-Christian context. We do have a few questions that have already come in, and we do have a lot of time, or a good amount of time, for a discussion. So the first question that has come in is from Yasser, who asks, do you think the Quran was reacting to Roman and Persian political conflict, and that the calls for peace were reflections of that? So maybe you could elaborate on that issue of peace, how it's situated in this context.
Absolutely. I went through and tried to trace all of the verses in the Quran which mention a word for peace, because there's more than one. And it seems to me very clear that the Quran is reacting against the savagery that's occurring all around it, with the Romans and the Iranians fighting one another, and huge armies meeting on battle plains. And in contrast, the early chapters of the Quran have a lot of verses about peace in the next life. And so heaven is depicted as peaceful. If you're good and you go to heaven, when you get up there, the angels say, Assalamu alaikum. They greet you with peace. And then you greet the other inhabitants of heaven with peace. And there's one set of verses that seems to suggest that there's kind of a pinnacle of the delights of heaven. The Quranic heaven is like a really nice resort. If I get my choice, assuming I go up there and you can choose which heaven to go to, I want that one, because it says that, people bring you fowl and fruits and delicious things, and then you commune with the other people who are there. They're all nice, but then it says this kind of 4 levels, and the highest level of paradise is when God addresses you and says peace to you. And peace means well-being, prosperity, security. It has all of these meanings, but it does mean peace. And the Quran says that in peace, nobody gets angry, nobody holds a grudge. Now, I think that image of heaven is in contrast to what was going on down on earth at that time, which was pretty miserable, and all of these battles and wars. And moreover, is being put forward as a model that we should try to be like those denizens of heaven, and not keep grudges and not be angry, and so forth. And in fact, there's a verse in the Quran about the fall of Adam and Eve, and when they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden for disobedience. And the Quran says that one of the ways that we can respond to this loss of Eden is to make peace. The word used is sulh, which has to do with conciliation and peace treaties and so forth. So I remarked in my book that whereas in Christianity, the fall produces original sin and all human beings are damned, and then we're only saved by Christ's sacrifice on the cross, in the Quran, it seems as though the way we're saved from the fall from Eden is that we have to actively become all peacemakers. And the Quran identifies the fall with human beings falling into wrangling with one another and fighting with one another and so forth. So I think the Quran is imagining an Eden there in the Hijaz, which hasn't been eaten up yet by these wars, and that much of the emphasis on peace is a reaction against this world war.
We have another question, which is, how does your interpretation, I'm presuming of the materials you mentioned here in your talk, differ from prevailing medieval and modern exegesis of the Quran?
Well, much of what I'm saying is in the medieval and modern exegesis. So I'm not saying something that's outlandish, from a Muslim point of view. And I quoted, one of the earlier exegetes, and similar statements are in, for instance, At-Tabari, which is a very well-regarded exegesis. There are some exegetes whose point of view differs here on a number of levels. First of all, the later Muslim writing about early Islam is late. We don't get extended works in prose until after the Abbasid revolution of 750. So the Prophet dies in 632. 750 is a long way away from that. And the new emperors, the new caliphs of the Abbasid Empire, seem to have commissioned longer works of commentary and biography of the Prophet and law and so forth. So we historians are very nervous about a source that's 150, 200, 300 years after the fact. And many of those kinds of sources are have been valued by Muslims in the medieval and modern period and given authority. I think academic historians just can't do that. They can't give them authority. Doesn't mean we have to disregard everything that they said, but in my view, the Quran is our only primary source, and we have to weight later reports in the light of the Quran, rather than the other way around, which some exegetes, prefer the later sources as a way of interpreting the Quran. So one issue that some medieval and modern commentators would have with me is that there are stories about the Prophet Muhammad attacking the Romans late in life. There's a battle supposedly against they call them the Rum, it means the Byzantines or the Eastern Romans, that's alleged to have happened. Different dates are given for it, 627, 628, 629, in Transjordan. Well, this is impossible. It's a piece of anachronism. They don't seem to have realized that the Romans didn't have Transjordan until probably, I think, until spring of 630. And so you can't have a war between Muhammad and the Byzantines in Transjordan in 627 or 629. It's impossible. And then the way that they tell this story is also suspicious, because sometimes they say it's against the Christians of the area, not against the Byzantines and so forth. So that's one, is that and I think this is an anachronism, because in later times, the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, which became known as the Byzantine Empire, was the major enemy of the Muslim caliphates. In the Umayyad and the Abbasids fought wars with them. And I think it became a matter of cognitive dissonance. It was kind of hard for people to accept that, if I'm right, the Quran is saying the victory of the Roman emperor was the victory of God, and now we're at war with the Roman emperor. So where does that leave us? And so I think there was an attempt to move away from the Quranic favorability towards the Roman Empire, because they're now the enemy. And then these stories, kind of emerged on a folk basis, I think, that the Prophet fought the Byzantines himself, and they were projected back. So that's one way in which they would differ with me. Another way is that some exegetes went wild with the notion of abrogation. There's a principle that's recognized by a Shafi'i and other jurists that later verses in the Quran abrogate earlier verses, and it has to be that way because, for instance, early on the Quran discourages the believers from coming to prayer drunk, and I think that's a really good piece of advice. But later on in the Quran, it discourages them from drinking at all. Says there's the good and bad in drinking and gambling, but the bad in them is worse than the good. Which I also think, how could you argue with that? But in any case, obviously that second verse is abrogating the first. It's saying you shouldn't drink at all, or at least you shouldn't get drunk at all. Not just at prayer. So that was a principle, and there were some medieval exegetes who I think were kind of bloodthirsty and warlike, who said that all the peace verses in the Quran were abrogated by the verses that commanded war against the pagans that were attacking the early believers. One of them estimated there were 110 verses that were so abrogated. And the problem with this is that other exegetes didn't agree with them about which verses were abrogated or thought that they went too far. Anyway, this idea that the peace verses were left behind when the wars of self-defense began doesn't make any sense, because the peace verses are most often about personal interactions rather than state interactions, and war was a matter of state. So I think they just were arguing on the wrong level. So those are two ways in which some medieval and modern exegetes might differ with my approach. However, a lot of them would agree with most of what I have said.
Another question, do you think that the love of Christians came out of the fact that they were the next religion after Jewish religion and went through the same phase as Muslims went through?
Well, I've suggested that the love of Christians partly has to do with politics, that they're allied with one another and favorable to one another. But despite that verse that says that, you know, you'll find the Jews are often enemies, the Quran also does have a lot of nice things to say about Jews. And I think it's talking about a particular group of Jews who, again, I think were probably allied with the Iranians in that verse. But elsewhere, it praises Jews. It says there are people among the Jews, there are people that are upright and serve as models for everybody else, and talks about their piety and praying. And there's a lot of very positive verses about Jews in the Quran. So, no, I don't think it's because the Christians were, temporally or in time-wise, were so close to the Muslim community. I think monotheists in general are very well thought of in the Quran, and the Jews and the Christians were both monotheists. I think it really has more to do with, you think about it, there were only a few hundred followers of Muhammad in Medina. They were being attacked by pagans who may have been directed to attack them by the Iranian authorities in Yemen. And then whenever they interact with the Christians, they get this warmth. Well, why wouldn't you say nice things about them?
I think perhaps on a similar point was the pro-Christian attitude throughout the Quran influenced by the safety early Muslims found in Christian Abyssinia. And I might say, well, why did they even go there to begin with? So yeah.
Yeah, there are narratives in the later Muslim sources that some early believers took refuge when they came under severe pressure from the pagans in Mecca in Christian Abyssinia, which, by the way, was allied with the Roman Empire. Even though it was Miaphysite, it had a different take on Christianity. Geopolitically, it tended to ally with Constantinople. So that would be an evidence, of this political alliance and the warm feelings that between Christians and the early believers in Muhammad. One caveat I would make is that the Quran doesn't mention anything about all this. So this is a case where my methodology is to start with the Quran and to weight material that seems in accordance with it in the later sources. Here, I don't have anything to go on. I'm not making an argument that the taking of refuge in Aksum didn't happen. I don't have any evidence to the contrary, but it's also not something that explicitly, at least, appears in the Quran. Although something like that verse that I pointed to, where it says the people who were given a portion of the book wish peace upon their enemies and so forth, and will receive twice over their reward. that could well be referring to the Christians in Aksum that gave the Muslims refuge. So in any case, that is a point in favor of my argument either way.
We have one from Amani who says, such an insightful lecture. Thank you, Professor Cole. With your less academic audiences, how do you put forward such arguments advocating Muhammad's calls for peace as sanctioned by Quranic exegesis when his legacy has been overshadowed by historically Orientalist negative notions of him as the Antichrist, etc., especially when one considers that an entire industry has been formed in popular literature, journalism, etc., around denigrating his memory?
Sure. Well, I find that when I talk to general audiences about this subject, if I give them the historical context and the verses of the Quran, the verses of the Quran are a very powerful primary source. It's hard to argue with them, and they're often, I think, a little bit surprised that these sentiments are in the Quran. But it is true. I mean, I was very well aware when I started writing a book about the Prophet Muhammad that there has been a lot of writing about him in the Christian world, which has been negative and which was polemical. And I didn't set out necessarily to praise him. I set out to write about him as an academic would write about him. And that means, again, depending on the Quran as the primary source, and then going as deep as we can into the text. And then as a historian, you always want to set things in context. And I found that if the Quran is set in its late antique context, most of the things that the Christians have complained about in it are Christian. And so cutting off of hands for violent theft is all over the Roman Christian law. And then sometimes Augustine, I have to tell you, no offense to anybody in the audience who admires him, seems to me a little bloodthirsty because he, the military authorities were used against heresies that he disapproved of, like the Donatists. And at one point he says, in my youth, I didn't approve of coercing people's conscience like that, but I've seen that it works. So Augustine even went to the point where he thought it was all right to use force, not only to defend the community, but even to coerce the conscience of heretics. And I would argue that the Quran never goes that far. The Quran always upholds individual conscience, and where it permits fighting, it's to avoid being killed.
We have a question and comment from our colleague, Richard Greenfield, says, very interesting, thank you. One suggestion by Byzantine East Roman historians in trying to explain the ease with which the Arabs took over their territory in the Middle East and the willingness of so many Christians to convert to Islam is that the regime in Constantinople was viewed by many, especially Miaphysites, in the area as a persecuting, exploitative, and increasingly irrelevant imperialist power. How does that square with your idea of the early Islamic community as pro-Roman?
Right. Well, I have to say that I don't have firm opinions about what happened after Muhammad died, because until then I have the Quran, which is a primary source. And after that, I don't have much in the way of primary sources until 150 and 100 and 200 years have passed. And so there is an allegation in John of Nikiu, which survives only in Ge'ez, I think, in Ethiopic, but which treats this era, that Miaphysites did convert to Islam in the wake of the Prophet's death, up there in places like Syria. However, Robert Hoyland has argued that he's gone through the sources. He can't find evidence of this feeling among the Miaphysite Christians of warmth towards their Muslim conquerors. What I would say, though, is that with regard to Muhammad's view of the Christian Roman Empire, and I think favorable views of Constantinople, is that he was holding these views at a time when probably, and we can't really prove it, probably a lot of Miaphysite Christians in Syria had gone over to the Sasanians. One dynamic that may have occurred after the Prophet's death and when the Western Arabian Muslims moved up into the Near East was that, well, things looked different. If the Sasanians had been defeated and now Heraclius was coming back in, and he was angry at these local elites for having supported the Iranians, and there is some evidence that at least he was angry at Jews for this. Why wouldn't he also be angry at the Miaphysites? Then both Jews and Miaphysites may have been chafing at the Constantinopolitan restoration and been very happy to see the Muslims show up with cavalry. The Syriac authors in the 7th century who talk about this mostly seem to think that the Iranian occupation was really hard on people because of the violence and so forth, and don't have much to say about the advent of the Muslims. And also, the archaeology doesn't show that the Muslim armies did a lot of destruction. If you dig in places like Damascus and Homs, you get down to the early 7th century, there's no ash. There's no evidence of cities being set to fire. Unlike, say, Jerusalem, where they have gotten down to the Persian period and they do find evidence of destruction. Not massive, as the literary sources say, but there was some. So anyway, that's the best I can do with that question.
Well, maybe as a follow-up, in the larger book, you've given us a kind of a particular argument within the context of your larger book's argument and characterization of early Islamic origins and the career of Muhammad. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit, because it seems part of the solution may be understanding, as you do in the book, that Muhammad had a particular reformist kind of vision, and that his understanding of peace and preaching of peace, has to sit in a particular context. It's not a and perhaps that would help us explain why it's why is it pro-Roman in this context. But beyond just a sense of alliance with that project, what is the kind of unique or particular doctrines and teaching and practice of peace that is relevant to his career? Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. And I would just encourage everyone to go buy the book, and it is available at the Novel Idea bookstore. There's a lot more in it than what you're hearing here in this particular presentation that you'll find interesting as well.
Yeah, well, so one way of looking at all this is that Muhammad was a preacher in a sanctuary city, as understood by Arabian culture, and in a sanctuary city that was dedicated to Allah. And his clan, if we can believe the later sources, the Banu Hashim, were shrine keepers. and also probably involved, well, we know the later sources say, and there's some evidence in the Quran for this, that they were providing hospitality to pilgrims who came to the sanctuary, to the shrine for blessings. And also may have been sheriffs, that is to say, what happens if tribal people come in for a festival related to the Kaaba, the shrine in Mecca, and they get to fighting with each other? How is that going to be settled? And typically it was settled in that society by an adjudication of who was at fault, and then the payment of blood money, diya, or weergeld in English. So that was the context for the prophet. Was he probably was from a clan dedicated to servicing this shrine and to maintaining the norms of peace in the shrine city. And the difference between Muhammad and the other Banu Hashim was that he appears to have had mystical experiences of Allah and to have experienced a monotheistic reformation, so that while the rest of the Meccans worshipped other gods alongside Allah in the environs of the Kaaba, Muhammad said, no, it's not right. There's only one God. And that one God, the Quran says, is the same God that the Jews and the Christians worship. Our God and your God are one God, it says. And the Bible is the story of the prehistory of the messages that God sent to people about his unity, about his oneness. And for the Quran, for Muhammad, monotheism is a sine qua non for salvation. How do you get saved? You have to believe in only one God. You have to reject the pagan gods. And so there is a kind of theological conflict implied in this, in the sense that pagans are going to hell. Polytheism is not allowed unless they repent. And on the other hand, I think a lot of people have assumed that would mean that you would have bad social relations with them. And even the later Muslim sources don't allege this. So the Prophet's uncle, Abu Talib, who led a clan of polytheist Banu Hashim, is alleged to have gone to bat for the Prophet, to have extended protection to him, and so forth, even though, with the exception of some of the Shia, the Tabari and other sources admit that Abu Talib never converted. So it's that theological struggle in the context of Arab practices of peace, of no feuding in the shrine city, no feuding during the holy months, and so forth, that Muhammad is now expanding this pre-Islamic Arabian idea of sanctuary and peace to argue for a community of peace, a community that wishes peace on others, a community that rewards attacks and evil with doing good and wishing peace, as long as the attacks are not physical. If they become physical, then they're very much like the feuding of the tribes, in which case there has to be restitution. And then there has to be some kind of formal peacemaking. And both the Quran and the later Muslim tradition see the Prophet's wars really as ways of negotiation with the Meccans into a situation where their peace is restored. And so there is according to the later sources, a peace treaty of Hudaybah in 628. And then the Quran says that when the followers of Muhammad come into Mecca in 630, regaining their homes in the city and so forth, it says that there was no fighting, that God on either side, that God prevented the hands of each other from reaching out in violence to one another. So there is a local Arabian context for practices of peace, and those Safavidic inscriptions that I mentioned, and there are tens of thousands of them, and they're very little studied as yet, are full of formulas for wishing peace on people and calling upon the gods to provide peace and security to people, including to the Roman emperors.
One other question that I had is there's obviously some very important episodes in the Sira tradition. You mentioned that, of course, there are a lot of very positive things said about both the peoples of the book, Christians and Jews, but that there is a whole tradition in the Sira that recounts hostile relations, warfare, violence, and so on with the Jewish community of Medina. And I wondered if maybe you had some views on that. Obviously, there's some sense that they're politically affiliated perhaps with the Persian Empire, but I wondered if you could contextualize that a little bit further, and how do you explain how that fit into the wider pattern?
That's a good question, Adnan, and it always comes up in these discussions. The later Sira literature about the Prophet Muhammad, which was produced initially by people like Ibn Ishaq, and then was edited by Ibn Hisham, and others, Al-Waqidi and so forth, that literature is extremely anti-Semitic. And it's full of accounts of Jews plotting against the Prophet Muhammad to assassinate him, of being a fifth column secretly allied with the pagans against the Muslims. And it talks about a raid by Muslims on a Jewish, largely Jewish town, in which 600 men are taken out and executed once they're captured, and so forth. My problem with all those accounts is there isn't anything like that in the Quran. As I said, there's lots of positive verses about Jews in the Quran. And while it's clear, it seems to me that if you try to arrange the Quran chronologically and try to follow things through, the Prophet's relations with the Jews, or at least with some Jews, did decline over time. But there's no allegation in the Quran that any Jews tried to assassinate the Prophet. There are allegations in the Quran of pagans plotting against him. So if that happened, why would the Quran talk about the one but not the other? And the Quran in the chapter of women, Surah An-Nisa, has a passage about how you treat prisoners of war. It says, either you let them go, or you ransom them until the war is over. There's nothing about slitting the throats of 600 POWs in the Quran. And then those very stories in the later biographical literature about the Prophet say things like, the Prophet's wife Aisha went and rescued one of the Jewish women that she knew, and they were sitting and having tea, and then they could hear the execution of the men, and the Jewish woman was completely impassive and didn't seem to show any emotion about all this. I mean, it's just anti-Semitism. So I can't find parallels in the Quran to virtually any of these stories. Another issue is that there's a phrase in the Medina period in the Quran, which I would translate those who have paganized among the people of the book. These are presumably Bible believers or monotheists of some sort who allied instead with the pagans instead of making a commonwealth of monotheists with the prophet. There is a passage in the Quran which talks about them being surrounded by the believers and their palm trees chopped down and being made to leave, exiled basically, for having allied with the Meccans, the pagans. But if we think about it, the phrase, those who have paganized from among the people of the book, it doesn't necessarily mean Jews. And it's clear from the archaeology that there's a lot more Christianity in Western Arabia at this time than the later Abbasid sources admit. And that would be consonant with the Quran, which seems to talk about Christians in Medina. So there could be Christians who, say, Miaphysites, who allied with the pagans and the Iranians against the Muslims. We don't know that those were Jews who were mentioned in that phrase. And there are also something called Sabians, which I think are probably pagan monotheists. There were such things in late antiquity, Neoplatonists or others, who could be those who paganized among the people of the book. And there are even some stories in the Abbasid literature about this kind of thing. So I just would toss all that out. I'm sorry, I just don't. It doesn't seem plausible to me. If you read the Quran as your primary source, then those later stories just don't make any sense in that context.
Well, I think we've had a very full program. You've been very generous with your answers to a great many questions. So I just want to thank you so much for this fascinating talk and encourage people that some of the questions have touched upon many of the other themes and elements that are discussed in the book. If you were interested in the conquest, so-called, of Mecca and other episodes like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in the tradition, you'll find out a lot about it in this book. So I encourage you to check that out. But for the time being, I just want to thank you very much, Dr. Cole, for this wonderful lecture and for opening our eyes on to a rather different perspective on Islamic origins in the context of late antiquity and of the political and religious world that actually existed at the time. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Edna.
Thanks again, everyone, for coming to this, the first of a series of events, the start of this year's events, but also to mark Islamic History Month. There are a number of other events upcoming. I'll be giving a talk called Peace is Possible, Lessons of Medieval Interfaith Relations Among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And there are going to be other events, and I also should point out that MSGP is co-sponsoring a conversation and discussion with Karim Abdul-Jabbar in early November that we can say is maybe a capstone of Islamic History Month, and look to our Facebook page, website, and other ways to connect with us for more information upcoming in the next week or so about details of that event and all of our other events. And also look out for our podcast, and you'll find information about the start of this new podcast on our website, Facebook page, and so on. Again, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you, talking with you again really soon.